Really, I think the best thing is this is a legislative solution in search of a non-existent problem.
I'm very pleased to finally get a chance to discuss my bill, C-504, which seeks to support volunteer firefighters. Before I discuss my bill as such, I would like to discuss fire departments because this is something directly related. You have to understand that fire services don't only respond to fires, but also to calls to help out people stuck in car crashes or people who have medical problems where ambulances cannot gain access to them, such as a hunter who fell out of his tower in an inaccessible place. So they don't just deal with fires. I think it's important to point that out. Now, we must also understand that fire departments are organized differently in rural and urban areas. In urban areas, there's a sufficient number of calls to have professional firefighters who are full-time, who've been trained professionally, and who are there to respond to calls. Whereas in rural areas, the volume of calls is insufficient to maintain that kind of staffing. Sometimes there are a few permanent firefighters who also do administrative work, but obviously you can't have full-time firefighting staff when you have a village of 1,000 people and that serves maybe a few other communities of 300 or 400 people in the surrounding area. There would not be a cost benefit that's reasonable there. So there's no choice. These are volunteer firefighters who do the job.
So the objective of my bill is to provide the right for a volunteer firefighter or part-time employee in a business under federal jurisdiction to leave their work if they are called upon to intervene and if the employer has been informed of their obligations. So it would allow people who are under federal jurisdiction respond to those calls, and all they have to do is inform their employer, and you can't just suddenly spring that as a surprise on the employer. I mean, the employer knows this in advance. They've been advised of the possibility of this occurring, and the employer would have to let the person go. Now, what's very important to specify as well is that there's the obligation to allow the person to leave unless there are very valid reasons to not do so, because sometimes it might not be applicable, and I think it's important to understand this. There is a logic that underlies all of this. It's clear that if the entire factory would stop running because one person leaves because they're on a critical piece of equipment, well, the employer could have a valid reason in such a case to not allow the person to leave. You'd have to wait until there is a replacement. If that person is the only security guard in a bank, for example, well, it's logical that they not just leave from one second to the next. There were security concerns there. So there is a logic to all of this that would allow an employer, if they had valid reasons to not allow the employee to leave, to not do so. But if those valid reasons don't exist, they have to let the person go on the call. It also prohibits reprisals against volunteer firefighters or part-time firefighters who have to leave their workplace to act as a firefighter. And it prohibits, for example, them facing any action because they did respond to the call, or someone who calls in the morning saying, I'm sorry, I was at a fire from 6 at night till 6 in the morning, and I haven't slept yet, so I can't work today. And that would this would mean that the employer can't take disciplinary measures in such a circumstance. It protects the firefighters. So that's a concrete example. It also bans the employer from, or it prohibits the employer from refusing to hire someone because they are a volunteer firefighter. If the boss says, well, I think that's pretty troublesome, I don't think I'll hire you, because after that I'll have to manage your calls, and that would become illegal. So 85% of firefighters are volunteers in Canada, and that represents 127,000 people approximately. This is a bill that would cost absolutely nothing, and this is something very simple that we can do that will help them. And just send this bill to committee and afterwards pass it for the well-being of our firefighters and our communities. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
This bill actually claims to protect the employment of volunteer firefighters working in a federally regulated business. I think it's important to note that according to the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, only an estimated 4.9% or 4,200 of 85,000 volunteer firefighters in Canada are hired by federally regulated businesses. So we're talking about a very small portion of the workforce. There's 3,200 volunteer fire departments throughout Canada, with most of them serving smaller communities with less than 10,000 residents. In many communities, they are often the only local emergency first responders, and as I say, have you ever traveled through a community that's rural or remote? Knowing that they're there is critically important. I know that the Honourable Member for Abitibi-Temiskaming tabled this private member's bill with the best of intentions. That said, I do have a number of concerns that I would like to raise. First of all, the changes in this bill, I think, would actually create more problems than solutions. You know, the sponsor of the bill claims it's going to help with volunteer fire departments with recruitment and retention in smaller sized communities. However, according to a survey conducted by the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, the biggest challenge that fire departments face is a lack of employment rather than unsupportive employers. So I think, Mr. Speaker, in some ways, Bill C-504 is a proposed legislative fix to really what is a non-existent problem. Across Canada, only 2 provinces have adopted this legislation. That's Quebec and Nova Scotia. And collective agreements are also telling us the same story. When reviewing a sample of more than 3,000 collective agreements, only 2 contain provisions related to volunteer firefighter duties. So therefore, in absence of a problem, the right approach to this is the status quo. We can trust employers and employees to come to an agreement which satisfies both the call of duty and local business needs. So I think, furthermore, I think there's many questions that have been left that are unanswered with this proposed legislation. It fails to clearly define certain concepts and conditions. For example, when would an employer have good cause to prevent an employee from leaving work? It's very unclear. Does that mean that with good cause, an employer could dismiss, suspend, lay off, demote, or discipline an employee for serving as a volunteer firefighter? Also, when and how would an employee be required to inform the employer of his or her obligations as a volunteer firefighter? Bill C-504 also fails to specify for which volunteer tasks an employee could leave work, because there are a large number of responsibilities for volunteer firefighters. You know, Mr. Speaker, my son is currently a volunteer firefighter, but they know he has to work it around his work schedule. He's a nurse in the intensive care unit and would have to travel 30 minutes to actually respond. So it would be very impractical in that case to have legislation that would sort of compel the employer to allow him to go. So, Mr. Speaker, I think in conclusion, the Bill C-504 is far too ambiguous, and for these reasons, the government simply can't support it. Bill C-504 would not provide genuine protection, but would create confusion and inequity while playing an unnecessary burden on businesses across Canada.
There are a number of aspects of this bill that remain, not addressed or vague, or it's somewhat strange in a number of ways that it may be applied. I'm just not certain as to where the problem was that sort of precipitated the bill coming forward. So I was surprised to see it come forward. But the other thing that concerns me, Mr. Speaker, and I would think it should concern the members of the NDP as well, and what we're doing is we're asking the government to change the Canada Labour Code, and we know that the Canada Labour Code is the bedrock, it's the foundation for the relationship between workers and employers and employees. The relationship between employer and employee should be one that's built through consultation and consensus. So, you know, if we are going to attack the government for their wrong-minded approach on those changes to the Labour Code, then I think there has to be a certain degree of consistency, you know, on the part of the opposition to, you know, to be consistent with that. To tell you the truth, I don't know enough about this bill, and I was hoping to learn more through this debate this evening, and I haven't seen anything in the debate that says, oh yeah, I get it now, I see where the problem was. Give us some cases where there's, where hardship has been met by volunteer firefighters, because in the time that we've had to look at this issue, we just haven't seen that. You know, in order to go in and make a change to the Canada Labour Code, that's something that we should not take lightly as legislators.